He thought control came from a badge, but some power doesn't need to announce itself. The metal clink echoed louder than it should have as Officer Daniel Hayes yanked open the car door under the sharp midday sun, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel heavier, slower, more intense, and right there on a crowded downtown street, with traffic crawling at barely 25 miles per hour and pedestrians pausing mid-step. He saw her not as a person, but as a problem to solve, a presence that didn't fit his idea of where she belonged. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, voice edged with authority that demanded compliance. And she did, slowly, calmly, her movements measured like someone who understood exactly how moments like this could spiral, her shoes touching the pavement as a few people nearby instinctively reached for their phones, the quiet hum of recording beginning before anyone said another word. She stood there in a simple blazer, nothing flashy, nothing loud, just a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time in the eyes of the man standing in front of her. And when he reached for her wrist, securing the cuffs with a final click that seemed to freeze the air around them, the crowd leaned in, curiosity mixing with judgment, whispers forming like a low tide rolling in. "You match the description," he added, as if that explained everything, as if that was enough. And she didn't pull away, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She just looked at him, steady, unshaken, like she was watching something inevitable unfold. "Officer," she said, quietly, her tone even, controlled, "you're making a mistake." But he didn't hear her, or maybe he chose not to, because it was easier to believe in his version of the story than question it. And around them, the city continued to breathe, horns in the distance, footsteps slowing, a bus stopping just long enough for passengers to stare out the window, capturing the moment in their minds, while a man across the street lowered his phone just long enough to make a call, his expression shifting from confusion to something else, something sharper, something urgent. And still she stood there, hands secured, shoulders relaxed, not defeated, not broken, just waiting, as if time itself was part of her plan. And for a brief second, something flickered across Hayes's face, a hesitation so small it could have been missed, but it passed just as quickly, replaced by the same rigid certainty, the same belief that he was in control, that this moment belonged to him, that the crowd was watching him enforce order, not question it, not challenge it. But what he didn't see, what none of them saw yet, was that the silence surrounding her wasn't weakness. It was something else entirely, something heavier, something that didn't need to speak to, be understood. And as the distant sound of engines began to cut through the city noise, low and unfamiliar, the kind that didn't belong to traffic or coincidence, the balance of power in that moment, though no one realized it yet, had already begun to shift. The sound grew louder now, not sharp like sirens but deeper, controlled, the kind of sound that did not rush because it did not need to. And a few heads in the crowd turned before Officer Hayes even noticed, his grip still firm, his posture unchanged, because in his mind nothing had shifted, nothing had challenged his authority. And yet the woman in front of him had not moved an inch, her breathing steady, her gaze level, as if she was not standing in the middle of a public scene, but somewhere far removed from it, somewhere quieter, more certain. And that was what unsettled it. Not enough to stop him, not yet, but enough to linger in the back of his thoughts like a question he did not want to ask. "You should have complied sooner," he said, almost as if trying to convince himself, while the phones around them kept recording, capturing every angle, every word, every second that stretched longer than it should have. And across the street, the man who had made the call stepped back, slightly, his eyes locked not on Hayes, but on her, watching, waiting, as if he recognized something the rest of the crowd did not. And then the first vehicle appeared at the far end of the block, dark, unmarked, moving slowly against the flow of traffic that seemed to part without knowing why. Conversations began to fade, replaced by a quiet tension that spread like a ripple through water, and Hayes finally turned his head, just enough to notice, just enough to register that this was not routine. But instead of stepping back, he straightened, his shoulders tightening, his expression hardening, because backing down in front of a crowd was not something he allowed himself to do, not under any circumstance. And still she said nothing, no protest, no demand, only that same calm presence that refused to match his energy. And for a moment it felt as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The vehicles came to a stop, doors opening with quiet precision, not rushed, not chaotic, just deliberate. And the people stepping out did not look around for direction. They already had it, their eyes scanning until they landed on her, not on the officer, not on the crowd, only on her. And that was the moment the balance shifted in a way no one could ignore. Hayes felt it before he understood it. The way the attention moved past him like he was no longer the center of the scene. The way the silence grew heavier, pressing against his certainty, and then one of them stepped forward, his voice cutting clean through the tension, calm but carrying a weight that did not need to be raised. "Officer," he said, and Hayes turned fully now, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. "You are going to want to remove those cuffs." And for the first time since this began, there was no immediate response, only a pause, a fracture in control, as Hayes looked back at the woman, really looked this time, as if trying to find what he had missed, but it was already too late, because whatever authority he thought he held in that moment was no longer his to command. For a fraction of a second, the world narrowed to the space between them. Officer Hayes standing there with authority that no longer felt as solid as it had just moments ago, and Angela Brooks, still calm, still composed, her wrists secured but her presence unchanged, as if nothing about this situation had the power to alter who she was. And that was what made the silence heavier, not louder, not chaotic, just undeniable. The kind of silence that forces people to pay attention, the kind that makes every movement feel deliberate, every word carry weight. Hayes shifted slightly, his jaw tightening as he looked from the man who had spoken back to the woman in front of him, searching for something that would restore the certainty he had lost. "I am handling this," he said, his voice firmer now, but there was a subtle strain beneath it, something that had not been there before, because the eyes on him had changed, the crowd no longer watching with curiosity but with expectation, waiting to see what he would do next. And the men who had arrived did not argue, did not raise their voices. They simply stood there with a stillness that spoke louder than any command, one of them stepping closer, not aggressively, not hurried, just enough to make it clear that this moment was no longer under Hayes's control. "Officer," the man repeated, slower this time, each word measured, "remove the restraints." And Hayes hesitated, not long enough for most to notice, but long enough for everything to shift further, because hesitation was not something he was known for, not something he allowed himself in front of others. And yet here it was, creeping in, uninvited, unavoidable. His radio crackled at his side, a voice on the other end asking for an update. But he did not answer, not yet. His focus locked on Angela as if she held the answer to a question he had not known to ask, and she met his gaze without resistance, without challenge, just a quiet certainty that did not need to prove itself. And in that moment, something inside him started to unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a thread being pulled loose from a uniform that had always felt untouchable. "You said I was making a mistake," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. And for the first time, his tone was not commanding, it was searching, and Angela tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, not in submission, just enough to acknowledge the question. "I did," she replied, her voice steady, carrying through the quiet street without effort. "And you still are." The words landed without force, without accusation, and yet they carried more weight than anything shouted. The man beside Hayes exhaled slowly, as if confirming something already known, and then he reached into his jacket, not rushed, not concealed, simply part of a process that had already been set in motion, the small motion drawing every eye in the crowd, every camera lens focusing tighter. Because everyone could feel it now, the turning point, the moment where whatever story they thought they were watching was about to become something else entirely. And Hayes saw it too, the badge being revealed, the insignia unmistakable, the authority undeniable. And in that instant, the ground beneath his certainty gave way, not with noise, not with chaos, but with the quiet realization that he had never been in control of this moment at all. The insignia caught the light just enough to silence the last whisper in the crowd, a small detail, almost easy to miss. But to the people who understood it, it changed everything, and Officer Hayes saw it. Not all at once, not in some dramatic flash, but in fragments. The emblem, the posture, the quiet authority in the man standing before him. And then something deeper, something harder to ignore. The way every single person who had stepped out of those vehicles carried themselves, not like they were arriving to assist, but like they were arriving to take over. And suddenly the space around him felt different, smaller, as if the street itself had shifted its allegiance. His fingers loosened just slightly, not enough to release control, but enough to betray the tension building beneath the surface. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," he said, the words coming slower now, less certain, and for the first time. No one rushed to respond, because the moment did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to her. Angela Brooks stood exactly as she had before, composed, grounded, her presence unchanged despite everything that had unfolded around her. And when she finally spoke, it was not loud, not forceful, but it carried through the silence with absolute clarity. "Officer, you made a decision without knowing who you were dealing with," she said, her eyes steady on his, not accusing, not angry, just stating a truth that could no longer be ignored, and Hayes felt it settle in, heavier than any command he had given that day. His radio crackled again, louder this time, a dispatcher calling his name, asking for status, but the sound felt distant, irrelevant compared to the weight of what was happening in front of him. One of the officials stepped forward, holding out identification, the details clear, official, undeniable, and the words that followed were not rushed, not dramatic. Just final. "You are currently detaining General Angela Brooks of the United States Army." The sentence hung in the air, not needing repetition, not needing emphasis, because its meaning was already unfolding in every corner of that street, in the widened eyes of the onlookers, in the stillness of the officers who had arrived, and most of all, in the expression on Hayes's face as the reality settled in piece by piece. He looked at the cuffs, then back at her, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the information he had just been given. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because this was the pause before everything changed. And then Angela shifted her gaze slightly, not away, but past him, toward the people watching, the ones who had recorded, who had judged, who had assumed. And there was something in that glance, something that reached beyond the moment, beyond the street, something that reminded everyone that what they were witnessing was not just about one officer or one decision. It was about something larger, something that had been unfolding long before this moment and would continue long after. And when she looked back at Hayes, there was no anger in her expression, only a calm certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. "Now," she said quietly, "I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next." And in that instant, the weight of the choice in front of him became undeniable, because for the first time since this began, he understood that the next move was not about control, it was about consequence. The weight of her words did not echo, it settled, deep and immovable, like something that had always been there waiting to be recognized. And Officer Hayes felt it in the way his grip finally loosened, not out of instruction, not out of force, but out of something far more unsettling, awareness, the kind that does not come with noise, but with clarity, slow and undeniable. His hands hovered for a moment as if caught between two versions of himself, the one who had acted without question and the one now standing in front of consequences he could not ignore. The crowd watched in silence, no longer whispering, no longer judging, just witnessing, because the story they thought they understood had shifted beyond their expectations, and the phones that had been raised to capture humiliation were now capturing something else entirely, something quieter but far more powerful. Accountability unfolding in real time. Hayes swallowed, his jaw tightening as he reached for the cuffs, the small metallic sound of them releasing cutting through the air in a way that felt louder than before, not because of volume, but because of meaning. Angela's hands lowered slowly, free now. But her posture did not change. She did not step back, did not step forward. She simply remained, grounded in a way that made the entire moment feel anchored around her. The officer standing across from Hayes stepped closer, his presence calm but absolute. "Step back," he said, not raised, not aggressive, just final. And this time Hayes did not argue, did not resist. He stepped back, one pace, then another, the space between them widening as if the distance itself was part of the correction. His radio continued to call his name, more urgent now, but he still did not answer, because whatever explanation he might have given no longer mattered in the face of what had already been seen, what had already been recorded. Angela adjusted her sleeve slightly, a small, almost unnoticeable movement, but it carried a sense of order returning, not to the street, but to the truth of the situation. She looked at Hayes again, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more difficult to face: composure without resentment, authority without display. And that was what made it impossible for him to look away, because there was nothing to fight, nothing to push against, only a reality he had failed to see. The official beside her spoke again, addressing Hayes directly. "Your actions will be reviewed." The words were simple, procedural, but they carried weight, not as a threat, not as punishment, but as consequence. And Hayes nodded once, almost automatically, as if acknowledging something that no longer required explanation. The crowd began to shift slightly, people lowering their phones, some exchanging looks that carried a different kind of understanding now. And through it all, Angela remained exactly where she was, the center of a moment that had never needed her to raise her voice to control it. The vehicles behind her idled quietly, waiting, not impatient, not urgent, just present, like everything else that had arrived not to escalate, but to correct. And as the tension that had once filled the street began to dissolve, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier but clearer, Hayes stood there, no longer the figure commanding attention, but the one standing in the aftermath of a decision he could not take back. And in that silence, the realization settled fully: that power had never belonged to the loudest voice in the room. It had always belonged to the truth that did not need to prove itself. The street did not return to normal, not right away, because moments like this do not simply disappear. They linger, stretching through the air long after the tension fades. And Officer Hayes stood there with his hands now empty, the absence of control more noticeable than the authority he had held minutes before, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty, but weighed down by something far less visible: the understanding that every action had already been witnessed, recorded, and would not be undone by silence. The officer who had stepped in earlier turned slightly, speaking into a secure radio with calm precision, his voice low but clear enough to signal that the situation had moved beyond local command. And nearby, one of the vehicles powered down its engine, the quiet hum fading into the background, as if even the machines understood that the moment required stillness. Angela Brooks took a single step forward, not toward Hayes, not toward the crowd, but into her own space again, reclaiming it without force, without announcement, her presence steady, grounded, as if nothing about her needed to change for the world around her to adjust. And that was what made the shift complete, because it was not driven by noise or reaction, but by truth settling into place. Hayes finally reached for his radio, his hand slower now, more deliberate, as if every movement carried weight he could not ignore. "Dispatch," he began, his voice lacking the sharp edge it once had. "Situation is resolved." He paused briefly, searching for the right words, but none seemed sufficient, because there was no code for what had just happened, no simple phrase that could contain the shift in power, the correction of assumption, the quiet collapse of certainty. The dispatcher responded, asking for clarification, but Hayes did not elaborate, not because he could not, but because he understood that the explanation would not come from him anymore. It would come from everything that had been seen, everything that had been captured. Angela glanced briefly toward the crowd, her eyes moving across faces that no longer held the same expressions they had before: curiosity replaced by reflection, judgment replaced by something closer to awareness. And for a moment, it felt as if everyone present understood that they had been part of something larger than a single encounter, something that revealed more than it resolved. One of the officials approached her quietly, speaking in a tone that carried respect without formality. "Ma'am, transportation is ready," he said, and she nodded once, acknowledging without ceremony, because there was no need for display, no need for emphasis. The authority was already understood, and as she turned slightly toward the waiting vehicle, Hayes found himself speaking again, the words coming before he could fully stop them. "General," he said, the title unfamiliar on his tongue in this context. And she paused, not fully turning back, but enough to acknowledge his voice. And in that brief moment, He searched for something to say, something that might restore balance. But the truth was there was nothing he could offer that would change what had already been done, and she did not wait for him to find the words, because she did not need them. Instead, she gave a small nod, not of acceptance, not of dismissal, but of closure, the kind that does not require agreement to be complete. And then she stepped forward, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy with tension, but with understanding. And as the vehicle door closed softly behind her, the street remained still for a moment longer, as if allowing the lesson to settle fully, because sometimes the most powerful shift does not come from force, but from the quiet moment when everything you believed about power is proven wrong. The vehicle door closed with a quiet finality that seemed to echo longer than it should have, not because of the sound itself, but because of what it marked, the end of a moment that had begun with certainty and ended in something far more complicated. And as the convoy slowly pulled away, moving at a steady pace down the same street that had witnessed everything, the crowd began to shift again, not dispersing immediately, but lingering, as if trying to process what they had just seen, phones lowering one by one, conversations starting in hushed tones, no longer fueled by assumption but by reflection. And in the middle of it all, Officer Hayes remained where he stood, the space around him no longer charged with authority but with absence, the kind that follows when something has been taken away not physically but internally. His radio buzzed once more, and this time he answered, his voice quieter, more controlled. "Go ahead," he said, and the dispatcher's voice came through with routine questions, but even those sounded distant, detached from the reality that had just unfolded, because there was no standard report for what had happened, no checkbox for misjudgment shaped by assumption. And as he spoke, giving only the necessary details, his eyes drifted to the ground where moments earlier he had stood with complete confidence. And it felt different now, not just the pavement, but the entire understanding of the space, as if the street itself had revealed something he had never noticed before. One of the bystanders, a man who had recorded the entire incident, hesitated for a moment before approaching, not too close, just enough to be heard. "You did not know," he said, his tone not accusing, not sympathetic, just stating something obvious. And Hayes nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any defense could, because it was true. He had not known, but that truth did not erase what had been done. It only explained it, and explanation was not the same as justification. The remaining officers on the scene began to return to their vehicles, their movements efficient but quieter than before, as if the usual rhythm of their work had been interrupted by something that could not be ignored. And Hayes finally looked up, scanning the faces around him, noticing the difference, the absence of the earlier whispers, replaced now by a kind of distance. Not hostility, not support, just awareness, the kind that changes how a person is seen without a single word being spoken. And in that moment, he understood something that had not been part of his training, something no manual had prepared him for, that authority without awareness is not control, it is risk, and that the uniform he wore did not define the situation. It only placed him in it, responsible for how he chose to act within it. The last of the vehicles disappeared at the end of the block, and the street slowly returned to its usual pace, traffic resuming, footsteps continuing, conversations blending back into the background. But for Hayes, nothing felt the same, because the moment had not ended for him. It had only shifted, turning inward, becoming something he would carry long after the street had forgotten. And as he stood there, the weight of that realization settling deeper, one thing became clear in a way it never had before, that power is not proven in the moment you act, but in the moment you understand what your actions truly mean. The day moved forward, but for Officer Hayes, time did not feel linear anymore. It felt layered, as if the moment on that street had split something open that could not simply close again. And later, when he sat alone in his patrol car parked along a quiet stretch just a few blocks away, the engine off, the faint ticking sound of cooling metal filling the silence, he replayed it all, not the noise, not the crowd, but the details he had missed, the calm in her voice, the steadiness in her posture, the absence of fear where he had expected it. And it unsettled him in a way he could not easily explain, because it forced him to confront something deeper than a mistake. It forced him to confront the assumptions that had led him there, the kind that operate quietly, beneath awareness, shaping decisions before they are even recognized as choices. And as he sat there, staring through the windshield at a street that looked no different from any other, he realized that what had changed was not the environment, it was his understanding of it. His radio remained silent for a while, an unusual break in the constant stream of calls that usually filled his shift, and that silence gave his thoughts room to surface in ways they normally would not. He thought about the moment she had said, "You are making a mistake," and how easily he had dismissed it, how quickly he had relied on his own certainty instead of questioning it. And now that certainty felt fragile, incomplete, like something built on a foundation he had never examined. A notification buzzed on the mounted screen in his car, a message from his department requesting a formal statement regarding the incident. The words plain, procedural, but carrying an implication he could not ignore. This was no longer just a moment on the street. It was something that would be reviewed, analyzed, documented, and that realization did not bring fear in the way he might have expected. It brought clarity, the kind that strips away excuses and leaves only the truth of what happened. He leaned back slightly in his seat, exhaling slowly, the weight of the uniform on his shoulders feeling different now, not heavier, but more defined, as if it carried a responsibility he had only partially understood before. Outside, a few cars passed by at regular intervals, their motion steady, predictable, a reminder that the world continues regardless of individual moments. And yet, for him, this moment would not simply pass. It would stay, not as a single event, but as a point of reference, something that would shape how he saw every situation that followed. His hand moved to the small notebook in the center console, something he rarely used, and he opened it, staring at the blank page for a few seconds before writing a single line. Not a report, not an explanation, just a reminder. Look twice before you decide. The words simple, almost understated, but they carried a weight that only he would fully understand. And as he closed the notebook, setting it back in place, there was no sense of resolution, no feeling that everything had been fixed or balanced, only the quiet recognition that understanding is not immediate. It is built over time, moment by moment, choice by choice, and that what happened on that street was not the end of something, but the beginning of a different way of seeing, one that would not allow him to return to the certainty he once held without question. The station felt colder than usual that evening, not because of the temperature, but because of the silence that lingered between conversations, the kind that forms when something unspoken is understood by everyone in the room. And as Officer Hayes stepped inside, the familiar sounds of keyboards, distant chatter, and ringing phones seemed slightly muted, as if filtered through the weight of what had already spread through the department. He did not need anyone to tell him that they knew. The looks were enough, not confrontational, not even judgmental, just aware, and that awareness carried its own kind of pressure, the kind that does not demand a response but waits for one. He moved past the front desk with measured steps, each one deliberate, controlled, as if trying to maintain the structure he had always relied on. But even that felt different now, less automatic, more conscious. And as he reached his desk, a small folder sat waiting, placed neatly at the center, its presence intentional. He paused for a moment before opening it, already knowing what it contained: the formal notice, the request for a full account, the documentation that would turn a moment into a record, something permanent, something that would not fade with time. He exhaled slowly and sat down, the chair creaking softly beneath him, grounding him in a space that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite years of routine. Across the room, a fellow officer glanced in his direction, then quickly looked away, not out of avoidance, but out of uncertainty, because moments like this shift more than just one person. They ripple outward, affecting how everyone sees the system they are part of. Hayes opened the folder, scanning the pages, the language precise, neutral, stripped of emotion, and yet every line pointed back to a single truth, a decision made without full understanding, a judgment formed too quickly. And as he read, he found himself not resisting it, not searching for ways to justify or explain, but simply acknowledging it, line by line, detail by detail, because the clarity he had felt earlier had not faded. It had settled, becoming something steady, something he could not ignore even if he wanted to. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a way that felt almost symbolic. each second moving forward regardless of reflection or regret, and after a moment, he reached for a pen, his hand steady but slower than usual, and began to write, not defensively, not carefully crafting a narrative, but truthfully, describing what happened as it was, including the parts that were uncomfortable, the assumptions he had not questioned, the certainty he had relied on too quickly, and as the words filled the page, there was no sense of relief, no immediate resolution, only a quiet alignment between what he had done and what he now understood, and somewhere in that process, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but internally, a recognition that accountability is not about a single moment of correction. It is about the willingness to face what led to it, to understand it fully, and to carry that understanding forward. When he finished writing, he placed the pen down carefully, the small sound echoing slightly in the quiet space, and closed the folder, not as an ending, but as the beginning of something that would continue beyond paperwork, beyond review, beyond the immediate consequences, because what had happened was no longer just an incident, it was a turning point, one that would follow him into every decision that came next, shaping not just how he acted, but how he saw. And as he sat there for a moment longer, the noise of the station gradually returning to its usual rhythm around him, one thing remained clear in a way it never had before, that understanding does not erase the past, but it defines what you do with the future. The night settled deeper over the city, and inside the station, the overhead lights cast a steady glow that felt almost too bright, too revealing, as if there was nowhere left to hide from the clarity that had taken root earlier that day. And Officer Hayes remained at his desk longer than usual, the completed report resting in front of him. No longer just paperwork, but a reflection of a moment that had already begun to reshape everything around him. The usual rhythm of the station continued. Officers coming and going, conversations rising and falling. But beneath it all there was a subtle shift, something unspoken yet present, like a current running just below the surface, and every now and then, a glance in his direction reminded him that this was not something that would simply pass unnoticed. A senior officer approached, not hurried, not tense, just steady, and placed a hand lightly on the desk. "They are going to review everything," he said, his tone neutral, not harsh, not reassuring, simply factual, and Hayes nodded, because he already knew. The cameras, the witnesses, the timing, all of it had already moved beyond his control the moment it happened. "Take the time to think it through," the senior officer added before stepping away, and those words lingered longer than expected, not as advice, but as an acknowledgement that this moment required more than a report, it required reflection. Hayes leaned back, slightly, his eyes drifting toward the far wall where a framed set of principles hung, something he had passed by countless times without really seeing. Words about service, integrity, responsibility, and tonight they felt different, not distant ideals, but immediate questions, and he found himself reading them slowly, as if for the first time, measuring his actions against them without the usual assumptions that had once made everything feel straightforward. And in that quiet process, there was no denial, no attempt to soften what had happened, only a growing awareness that integrity is not tested when things go as expected. It is tested in the moments when your assumptions are wrong, when your certainty leads you somewhere it should not have, and how you respond to that defines more than the mistake itself ever could. The station clock moved past another hour, and one by one the desks around him emptied, the noise fading into a quieter hum, until it was just him and the low, ambient sounds of a building that never fully sleeps. He reached for his badge, unclipping it carefully and placing it on the desk in front of him, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a moment of separation, a chance to see it not as a symbol of authority, but as a responsibility that required constant awareness. He studied it for a few seconds, the edges, the engraving, the weight of it in his hand, and for the first time, he understood that the badge itself does not create trust, it only represents it, and trust is built or broken in moments like the one he had lived through earlier. Outside, a patrol car passed slowly, its headlights casting brief shadows across the walls, and Hayes remained still, letting the quiet settle, not searching for resolution, not expecting immediate answers, only recognizing that this was the point where change begins, not loudly, not all at once, but in the decision to see clearly, to question what once felt automatic, and to carry that awareness forward. Because what happened on that street was not just a mistake, it was a mirror, and now that he had seen what it reflected, there was no returning to the version of himself that had acted without looking twice. Morning arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet transition where the light shifts slowly across the city, and inside the department building, the air felt different, not tense, not heavy, but expectant, as if something was about to be addressed that could no longer be ignored. And Officer Hayes stood just outside a closed conference room, his posture straight but no longer rigid, his hands at his sides instead of resting on his belt, a subtle change that reflected something deeper. The door opened, and a voice from inside called his name, not sharp, not welcoming, just neutral, and he stepped in. The room, arranged simply, a table, a few chairs, a screen on the wall displaying paused footage, the same footage that had already been seen, shared, and discussed, and now reduced to a sequence of moments ready to be examined frame by frame. He took a seat as instructed, the chair firm beneath him, grounding him in a space where everything would be measured not by instinct but by clarity. Across from him sat two officials, their expressions calm, professional, not accusatory, but focused, because this was not about emotion, it was about understanding. One of them pressed a button, and the video began, the scene unfolding again. The street, the voices, the movement, but now slower, more deliberate, each second given space to be seen for what it truly was. And as Hayes watched, it felt different than before, not distant, not detached, but immediate, because now he was not inside the moment. He was observing it, seeing what others had seen, hearing the tone in his own voice, noticing the details he had overlooked, the calm in hers, the lack of resistance, the words he had dismissed. And each of those details carried weight, not as accusations, but as points of reflection. The video paused at a specific frame, Angela standing still, looking directly at him, her expression composed, her voice just about to speak, and one of the officials leaned forward slightly. "What did you hear in that moment?" he asked. And Hayes did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the answer required more than a quick response, it required honesty. "I heard a refusal," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than usual, and the official nodded once, not confirming, not denying, simply acknowledging the answer before pressing play again. The words filled the room. "You are making a mistake," and the pause that followed felt longer than it had in real time, because now it was clear, the opportunity that had been there, the moment where a different choice could have been made. The video moved forward, the arrival of the vehicles, the shift in the scene, the change in tone, and then it stopped again. Another frame, another question. "What do you see now?" the official asked, and this time Hayes did not hesitate. "I see that I decided too quickly," he said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything that had led to them, and the room remained quiet for a moment, not because there was nothing left to say, but because that recognition mattered more than any explanation. The officials exchanged a brief glance, not signaling an end, but a continuation, because this was not about assigning a single conclusion. It was about understanding the process that led there. And as the session continued, question by question, frame by frame, Hayes found himself not defending, not justifying, but examining each answer, building on the last, each realization connecting to something deeper, until it became clear that this was not just a review of an incident. It was a reconstruction of awareness, a step-by-step process of seeing what had once gone unnoticed. And when the video finally stopped for the last time, the screen fading to black, the silence in the room felt different, not heavy, not tense, but resolved in a way that did not erase what had happened, only clarified it. And as Hayes sat there, looking at the now blank screen, one thing stood out with unmistakable clarity, that the most important moment had not been when he acted, but when he finally understood why he had acted the way he did. When the session ended, no one rushed to stand, no one spoke immediately, because the kind of clarity that had just unfolded did not invite noise. It invited reflection, and Officer Hayes remained seated for a moment longer, his eyes still on the dark screen, as if it might reveal something more if he waited. But there was nothing left to show, only what had already been understood. And as he finally stood, the movement felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, but more deliberate, as if each step now carried a level of awareness that had not been there before. He thanked the officials quietly, not out of habit, but out of recognition, because what had taken place in that room was not just a review. It was a turning point, and they acknowledged it with a simple nod, not as approval, not as closure, but as an understanding that the process had begun, not ended. Outside the room, the hallway stretched in front of him, familiar in structure but unfamiliar in feeling, as if the place itself had shifted slightly. Reflecting the change within him, a few colleagues passed by, some offering brief glances, others continuing on without pause, but there was no tension in their movements, only the natural adjustment that follows when something real has been acknowledged. And Hayes walked slowly toward the exit, not avoiding anyone, not seeking anyone out, just moving forward with a quiet sense of purpose. When he stepped outside, the daylight felt sharper, clearer, the sounds of the city more distinct, as if his perception had adjusted along with everything else. Cars moved steadily, people crossed the street, conversations carried on as usual, and yet, beneath all of it, there was a subtle difference in how he observed it, not scanning for problems, not jumping to conclusions, but noticing details, small things that might have once been overlooked, the way someone paused before speaking, the way another person held their ground without raising their voice, the way presence could communicate more than words ever could. And as he reached his patrol car, he stopped for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, placing his hand on the door handle and simply standing there, taking in the moment, allowing the shift to settle fully, because he understood now that awareness is not something that arrives all at once. It builds, it strengthens, it requires attention, and before getting in, he glanced down at his reflection in the window, not searching for who he had been, but recognizing who he was becoming, someone who no longer relied solely on instinct, but on understanding, someone who knew that authority is not defined by action alone, but by the thought that comes before it. He opened the door and sat inside, the familiar space now carrying a different meaning, not just a place of duty, but a place of responsibility that extended beyond procedure. And as he started the engine, the sound steady and controlled, he did not rush to move. Instead, he adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, catching a brief glimpse of the road behind him before focusing forward, because that was where everything he had learned would matter most, not in reflection alone, but in application, in the next decision, the next interaction, the next moment where he would have the choice to act with awareness or without it. And as the car slowly pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of the city, one thing remained clear: that growth does not erase the past, but it reshapes the path ahead. And the difference between who you were and who you become is defined by what you choose to carry forward. The city moved forward the way it always does, steady and indifferent, traffic flowing through intersections, people crossing streets with places to be, conversations rising and fading into the background. And yet for Officer Hayes, every moment now carried a quiet awareness that had not existed before, not something overwhelming, not something that slowed him down, but something present, like a second layer of understanding beneath everything he saw. And as he drove through the same streets, where he had once acted without hesitation, he found himself noticing more. The way a driver paused just a second longer before turning, the way a pedestrian looked around before stepping off the curb, the small signals that revealed intention if you were willing to see them. And it was not about doubt. It was about attention, the kind that asks one more question before making a decision, the kind that recognizes that every situation holds more than what appears on the surface. Later that day, he responded to another call, routine on paper, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just a situation that required presence. And as he arrived, stepping out of his vehicle, he felt the difference immediately, not in the scene itself, but in how he approached it, slower, more observant, allowing space before action. And the people in front of him, strangers just hours ago, were no longer shapes to be categorized, but individuals to be understood. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything about how the moment unfolded. No raised voices, no unnecessary escalation, just conversation, clarity, and resolution that came not from control, but from awareness. And as he returned to his car afterward, there was no sense of victory, no dramatic realization, just a quiet confirmation that something had changed, something real, something lasting. and that it would continue to shape every moment that followed. Because growth does not announce itself. It shows up in the choices you make when no one is watching, when there are no cameras, no audience, just you and the decision in front of you. And as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the road, Hayes slowed at a red light, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his eyes steady, focused not just on what was in front of him, but on how he chose to see it. And in that stillness, there was no need for resolution, no need for closure, because the story had never been about a single moment. It had always been about what comes after, about how a person carries forward what they have learned, and whether they allow it to shape them into something better, something more aware, something more just. The light turned green, and the car moved forward smoothly, blending back into the rhythm of the city, not as the same officer who had stood on that street days before, but as someone who now understood that power is not proven in the moment you act. It is revealed in the moment you choose to see clearly before you do.